We have two wonderful stories today. We might even say three wonderful stories. Certainly that first one about Elijah from the book of Kings. And then our gospel, in some ways, is two stories. It's the story of Jesus walking on the water, but it's also the story of Peter's struggle once again with his faith. But as I reflected on these readings earlier this week, I remembered a reflection that I had read during the Easter season. I think the reflection was from someone writing about the Ascension, or the readings of the Ascension. And the person who was writing said that she had read a book by the rather famous author Alan Arkin. And she was reading one of his books, and he was relating a story of something that happened to him. And he said he had this experience with a woman who had just seen something very spectacular. And she was standing right beside Mr. Arkin, and she said out loud, "I refuse to believe it." And Mr. Arkin said to her, "Well, how can you refuse? I don't understand. Either you saw it or you didn't." "No, I refuse to believe it," she repeated. But then she went on, "Because if I believe this, I'm going to have to believe a lot of other things, and I refuse to do that." It was a story or a experience that sort of caught my attention. Can you see sort of Elijah standing at the entrance of that cave and having everything that has happened, and rather than hiding his head in the cloak because he knew it was God, saying, "I refuse to believe this"? Or the disciples today, seeing Jesus walking on water, walking on the sea in the midst of a storm, saying, "I refuse to believe that." Well, Mr. Arkin was making the point that, or the woman was making the point that if she believed in what she had just experienced, then it was going to demand something from her. And that happens over and over again in our experience of Jesus. In listening to the scriptures, in the stories that we're confronted with. You know, Elijah is running for his life at this moment in the story. But God asked him to come to that mountain and becomes present to him, not in all the other ways of the Old Testament that God often is recognized, in a tiny whispering sound. And I have to believe that Elijah knew that if he believed this, it was going to demand so much more from him, and it did. The disciples, Peter in particular, but all the other disciples there, if they believed, if they came to understand what was taking place in that miracle of Jesus walking on the water, over and over again, as they've experienced already, it was going to demand something of them. Ultimately, for many of the disciples, it was going to demand their life. And I often think of that in terms of our Eucharist. If we come and we believe, well, it's going to demand something from us. We can run away from it, but it's here. The simple elements of bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. And if we believe, wow, sky's the limit. Eternal life can be ours, but we're going to have to invest. We're going to have to live it out.